Next, let's look at his actual interpretation and translation of this text in question.
两肘不离肋，两手不离心，出动入动紧随身，乘其不备而攻之，焉其不义而击之。Translation: Two elbows do not leave the rib cage. Two hands do not leave the heart. Elbows and hands moving inward and outward will follow the body. So, attack when the opponent is unprepared and strike the opponent by surprise. End translation.
What's really interesting with his translation is that he omitted a very important word in his translation. Now, I'm not sure if he did this on purposely or he genuinely forgot to translate it, but with or without this crucial word in the translation changes everything, and with this word included and with this important word translated, it pretty much disproves his version of the interpretation of what this text is supposed to mean. So the text reads, 两肘不离肋，两手不离心，出动入动紧随身. So that word 紧 he did not translate. So just like what he said, 两肘不离肋 means the two elbow does not leave the rib. 两手不离心, the two hand does not leave the heart. And in this case, heart refers to the center line, not to the physical heart. 出动入动紧随身. Exiting the cave and entering the cave, it must tightly follow the body. So the word tightly 紧 he did not translate, and that changes everything, because according to him,
in the Chinese language, very often many words are removed from a term to make it sound phonetically pleasant. So the phalanx should actually be written as the entire space in the vicinity of the rib cage, not just the physical rib cage.
This text simply means your elbow is in the vicinity of the rib. So just wherever you are, sometimes it's not somewhere there, it's cool. But no, that is definitely not correct because of the word 紧. 紧 means tightly follow your body. So basically, if your elbow is right touching your rib, that's tightly. If your elbow is here, you can't call that tightly. Doing a punch like this, right, I don't know if you can see, cannot be called tightly. This is tightly. And furthermore, from the choice of the description, obviously 出动入动, exiting a cave and entering a cave, is a figure of speech referring to when you throw your hand out for a strike and your hand returning from a strike. But just think about this, why did the original author chose to describe it as a cave? Right? If you imagine there's a cave here, and your hand is exiting the cave, and then returning, aka entering the cave again. Why is this significant? Well, because if you have a hole here, your hand is going out and coming back. If your elbow is not in the same line of path to your fist, your hand will get stuck when you're trying to move through a cave. Think about it, right? Just imagine there's a cave. If my elbow is sticking out and not in the same trajectory line as my fist, you cannot exit the cave or into a cave properly. So the fact that it describes this whole motion as exiting and entering a cave further illustrates that your hand and your elbow need to follow the same line of path, the same trajectory outward and inwards. And if you add all three of those proverb lines together, the elbow does not leave the rib, right? The fist or the hand does not leave the heart, the center line, and entering and exiting a cave, and obviously if your hand does not exit the center, does not leave the center line, then the cave have to be right in front of you, right? And if you imagine you sitting here, center line is a cave in front of you, and imagining you send you punch through this imaginary cave, and your elbow tightly follows the rib, and obviously it says 出动入动紧随身, entering the cave, tightly following the body. So you can clearly see what the proverb is trying to mean. It's basically to teach you to always launch your punch in a linear trajectory as straight as possible towards your target. And once you understand this, then clearly by putting your elbow sticking to the side does not obey this proverb, no matter how he tries to spin the meaning of this proverb. Then you might ask, then what about the next two lines that Haiyang used to justify his point of view, which is 趁其不备而攻之，由其不意而出之, right? Which basically means you want to strike your opponent when he's not expecting it and surprise attack him. So wouldn't that suggest the front portion of the description refer to a combat stance? Firstly, obviously, if you already understand the analogy of exiting and entering a hole, and then you emphasize on the word 紧, which is tightly, you already know it's definitely not talking about a combat stance that having elbow not touching your rib. It doesn't fit the description at all. But let's just further consolidate my point by explaining how the next two lines fit into this whole picture. Now, if you imagine you are my opponent and you're looking at me from the front, and I have my elbow tightly following my body, next to my ribs, my fist right in the middle of my chest, then when I launch that punch to you, do you notice something? Other than my fist growing bigger, you don't see anything else moving on my body. Whereas if I stick my elbow out and do this, notice that you can actually see my entire forearm moving forward. So why is this important? Well, it's the difference between telegraphed and not telegraphed. Do you know why cars have brake lights? It's because if you're following a car and the car in front of you suddenly brakes, you cannot pick up that action in time if you're driving at a reasonably fast speed, which is why they have brake lights. So when the light goes on, then you know that the car in front of you is braking, therefore you brake too to avoid a collision. Now, why can you not tell when the car is braking without brake light? Because when an object is moving to you directly in a linear line, it just gets bigger. And our sensories does not pick that up nearly as efficient as looking at something moving horizontally across. Which is why if you take a car, give it the same speed, if it's directly in front of you, reducing that speed, you can't really tell. But if you see a car driving like this, and suddenly he brakes, you can immediately tell. That is the way our eyes and sensory system and our brain works. Which is why, if everything in my punch is hidden behind my fist, that makes the motion much harder to read, which is why it says when you do this, you can surprise attack the person. You can hit him before he is expecting it. Whereas if you stick your elbows out, then he can see the entire forearm, then any motion you do is far easier to read. So in fact, that is the reason the last two lines were included in this entire section of the Xingyi classical text. And if you add everything together, then there is no room for argument or doubt that what this refers to is not a combat stance, but how you should launch your strikes when doing Xingyi. So in conclusion, if we look at the first fact that this entire chapter is called 手脚篇, right, the hand and feet chapter. I think some also translate to 手足篇. It doesn't matter. No matter which version it is, it refers to the hand and the guidance of hand and feet, or the requirement, the method of hand and feet, which already established that this whole chapter talks about how you should conduct your training on both your hand and your feet. And then we talk about how this portion of the classical text refers to the elbow do not leave the ribs, the fist of the hand do not leave the center line. Exiting the cave, entering the cave tightly follows the body. And you should strike someone without them being prepared. You have to surprise them. And this whole thing together, it should be pretty clear to see that this refers to all the hand techniques that you have in Xingyi at the time this text was founded. And therefore, when anyone do 5 elemental fist with the elbow sticking out, it's just simply not right. Even if we ignore the laws of physics and just look from the point of view of the Xingyi classical text.
In classical Chinese language or 文言文, very often people put the part that they want to express at the end of the sentence group by using neither extension of meaning or tautological method, or opposite of meaning or antithetical method. There are classical linguistic structures largely ignored by new generations or uneducated people in the older generations. In that case, the second part of the sentence group, which is the striking and attacking part, is the concept that the writer intended to express, which is the opposite of meaning or antithetical method used in language structure. I have been studying the classical Chinese language or 文言文 since I was a child. I can use the classical style to write Chinese articles, poetry, and other forms of literature. Combining that with my Xingyi practice experience enables me to interpret Xingyi and other martial art classics without any difficulty. And it is understandable that many people easily make mistakes in interpreting them since they lack the necessary cultural understanding and context.
Alright, so now here he is insinuating that he is an expert on the classical Chinese language, while others, most likely like myself, who disagree with him, is not, and therefore I don't understand the proverb. Also, here is the thing, right? 文言文, the classical Chinese, is not what is used to written the Xingyi classical text. A lot of uneducated Chinese makes the mistake of assuming that any text written from the Qing dynasty and further back are automatically 文言文. That is utterly incorrect. Ever since the Han Dynasty, there has been three types of writing system in the Chinese culture. First, you have the ancient classical Chinese. So in the Han Dynasty, that would refer to the Zhou Dynasty and the spring-autumn to warring states period of writing style. And then they have the current classical writing system, which if it's Han Dynasty, it refers to Han Dynasty writing. If it's Tang Dynasty, it refers to Tang Dynasty writing. And then there's always a third group of writing called 白话文, which is the common tongue. Okay, so make no mistake, not everyone from the old day, which is Han Dynasty, Tang Dynasty, Song Dynasty, not everyone spoke like 文言文. That is a common misconception that a lot of people who doesn't study history does not know and makes the mistake of assuming. So what this basically means is that common people spoke with a common tongue. However, scholars who also speak the common tongue, when they write in the older form of the language system in order to show that they are better educated. So it does not mean, for example, let's take the Song Dynasty. When you see a Song Dynasty scholarly text, it is written in the form of classical Chinese literature. But this does not mean the author of that text speaks during his days like the way he writes. So the first thing you have to understand is that even during those historical period, people still have 白话文, the common tongue. And then you have to know that only scholars would go out the way to learn the so-called 文言文or the classical text and literature in order to apply it when they write stuff so that they don't look like a complete noob or farmer. However, most people, they spoke in the common tongue. Now, why is this important? Well, the founders of Xingyi, as well as the people from the Dai family Xingyi, they are not scholars, which means they spoke the common tongue of Qing dynasty. And because they are not scholars, there are no reason for them to actually learn 文言文 of the Qing dynasty, and therefore the entire text was not written in 文言文 at all. Okay? Martial art practitioners in general are mostly uneducated. It's pretty rare that they can even read or write, never mind being able to read or write high-end classical older style of literature. Therefore, only someone who actually doesn't know much about Chinese history and literature would assume that the Xingyi classical text is written in Wenyan. It clearly is not. It's written different to how we will speak today, but the sentence structure, the wording are almost the same. Except there are certain words that we use now that don't use back then, such as de. De is basically a word that we actually learned from the Japanese during the Republic era. This isn't a video about language, so I'm not going to explain too much of that. But just remember that if we take out de in our current modern Chinese language, it will pretty much look like how things are in the Xingyi classical text. Which means if you take this piece of text to any high school student in China today, they will be able to tell you exactly what everything is saying. Of course, the descriptions that are vague, they probably don't know the true meaning of. But in terms of language and sentence structure, a high school student today will have no problem translating everything accurately. So this whole thing about him being expert in the language and other people don't know what they're talking about is utterly BS. And of course, if we really want to measure qualification, well, I've been reciting Buddhist Sutra since I was 4 years old. I already knew how to recite the full Heart Sutra when I was 4 years old. When I was 7 and 8, I was then made to read Buddhist Sutra text. If you don't know what that is, Sutra is basically the Buddhist version of like a Bible, and it is written in the classical language of the Tang Dynasty. That's when most of the Mahayana Sutra were translated. So my father basically required me to read those texts since I was around 7 and 8 years old. And the words I didn't know, I had to write pinyin next to it and eventually learn those words. And that's how I was able to learn to read traditional Chinese writing rather than just simplify, which is what they actually teach in China. And after that, I've been constantly reading classical texts from the Spring-Autumn Warring State period. Okay, I've read the 4 books from Confucius' study, right? 四书. I've read 墨子, 孟子, 老子, 庄子, 鲍朴子. Obviously, these probably don't mean anything to you. Just know that these are all pretty famous classical texts from the Spring-Autumn Warring State and Han Dynasty. So even if we were to talk about the knowledge in classical Wenyan, I'm still decently well versed to know what I'm talking about. But of course, that's not even part of the argument because the classical Xingyi text is not written in Wenyan. And furthermore, the meaning of those proverbs is commonly agreed upon majority of the Xingyi community in China. There is no one in China who believes that the piece of text refers to a defensive position and that the elbow only has to be in the vicinity of the rib and not touching the rib. And this further goes to show you that if you don't have enough knowledge, you cannot spot a lie or a BS, and therefore if you don't actually speak Chinese, you really don't know what's going on, and if he is only source of information you have, naturally you would get it wrong.
To summarize, 肘不离肋，手不离心 describes a guarding posture. It does not imply that an elbow sticks to the rib cage and the fist stays on the chest, or simply the elbow sinks downward and the hand stays on the chest. It is just a simple proverb, yet it confuses many people and can lead them to faulty conclusions.
So here he's basically suggesting that Silu Tang is wrong, because in Silu Tang's own writing, he clearly says that 起钻落翻, rising draw, falling turn, 总要手不离肋，手不离心. You always have your elbow next to your rib, your hand in front of your center line. And of course, if he would actually stop making nonsense like this, then the Xingyi community wouldn't be confused on what this classical text actually is supposed to mean. So he's acting like everyone else is confused on the topic, but in actuality, he's the one that is convoluting the topic.
肘不贴肋, which is another important principle of practice. Accompanying 肘不贴肋 or elbow does not stick on rib cage, there's another proverb very often cited in the community. 腋下含空. 腋 means armpit, 下 means under, 含 means contains Kung means space. Put together, it means there is a space under the armpits. So, the 腋下含空 or a space under the armpits is the cause of 肘部贴类.
Now this is getting funny because his fanboys has accused me of not qualified to talk about this topic because I don't personally practice Xingyi, and that the fact that I have decades of experience in Taiji, Yiquan, and in more recent years Wushin Tongbei have no credibility to criticize someone practicing Xingyi simply because I don't do Xingyi. But you see here, your idol is basically trying to use Taiji principles to justify his elbow position in Xingyi. And I find that quite ironic. Notice that when he's citing these two lines, one being 肘部贴类, one being 腋下含空, he doesn't actually say where these two lines came from, right? Previously, when he's citing his proverb, he made sure to say that it's coming from his hand-copied, written, Dai family Xingyi classical text. But why over here all of a sudden he stopped saying where these two lines of proverb came from? Well, because they do not came from the Xingyi classics, and you don't find them with any of the Xingyi classical text. And therefore, I would ask, what is the relevance or the bearing of this proverb had to do with the positioning of the elbow in Xingyi?
张肇东's branch of Xingyi emphasizes 肘部贴类 a lot, and most of the Tai Chi schools also take 肘部贴类 as an important requirement for correct body structure.
So I actually spoke to my close friend who is from the Zhang Zhaodong lineage of Xingyi and Bagua and asked him about this whole 肘部贴类. And yes, in Zhang Zhaodong lineage, according to my friend, they do have the concept of 肘部贴类. However, it comes with a caveat. So firstly, they train both 肘部离类 and 肘部贴类. So they don't just do the one or the other, they do both. And more importantly, 肘部贴类 refers to specific situations, such as when they're doing the Santi stance, that sometimes they do it with the elbow tucked in and touching the rib. I don't know if you can see. So they do it with the elbows tucking the ribs. And there are also times where they do Santi stance with the elbow sticking out slightly more roundish. But before you say, okay, no, therefore, it's settled that Haiyang is right, I did specifically ask him, what about your punches, your 5 elemental first? And I sent him a screen grab of Haiyang's single hand 5 elemental first exercise. And he told me pretty clearly that no, that is wrong, even according to their understanding of 肘部贴类. When they do a punch, whether it's 劈崩钻炮横, the elbow still comes out touching the rib. The 肘部贴类 part only referring to the backhand, not to the hand that is doing the strike. Here's a video sent to me by my friend from Zhang Zhaodong lineage of his Xingyi brother doing the 5 elemental linking first. And his points, and you can clearly see, is that the elbow on the striking arm does not stick out, which is obvious given how we've explained the physics behind it, as well as how clear the classical text was on the position of the elbow. Which is very similar to one of my older videos where I talk about why Yiquan have the elbow sticking out, where I say that while the stance is like this, the moment they do a 钻拳, the elbow comes in. So just because my friends Zhang Zhaodong lineage do Santi stance with this elbow slightly rounded and sticking out, when they actually do a 钻拳, the elbow immediately comes in before they launch the punch. When they do 劈拳 as well, 崩拳 as well, they never launch any of the 5 elemental first with the elbow sticking out. So over here, I'm not sure if Haiyang doesn't actually know anyone from the Zhang Zhaodong lineage, or he just, again, chose to omit the whole truth. But what he is saying is not completely true. He's only telling a small portion of the truth to make his argument seem legit. As for the Taiji part, well, firstly, Taiji is not Xingyi. Yes, they have the same fundamental forces and mechanics because they're all internal styles. However, Xingyi came from the long spear, which means their hand body position is catered for holding a spear. Tai Chi is not. Tai Chi have a roundish expansion structure. So you can't use Tai Chi's requirement for having space under the armpit or for the elbow not touching the ribs to justify Xingyi. Those are not the same. And furthermore, if you look at actually the few of the straight punches you have in Tai Chi, such as Ban Lan Cui. Over here you can first see a photo of Yang Chengfu doing Ban Lan Cui. Notice where his elbows at. If that is not enough, here's a footage of a Tai Chi master Wang Yongquan doing Ban Lan Cui facing the audience, during which you can clearly see his elbow is not sticking out and is traveling on the side of his body and rib. You can also see that when someone does a Ban Lan Cui, the rib and the whole fist travels next to the rib, which means that even in Tai Chi, if you were to do a straight punch that is similar angled and high to a Beng Quan, the elbow comes next to the rib. They don't do a Ban Lan Cui with the elbow sticking out. So this whole thing about Tai Chi not wanting to touch the ribs and want to have space under the armpit, you can pretty much refer to my past video on why Yi Quan sticking the elbows out, and that should explain already why Tai Chi does it that way. And why that, as long as they're doing a straight punch with a vertical fist or an uppercut tackle fist, then no matter what style it is, the elbow comes in. And in case you wonder why that is the case, it's simply because that is the only way to have the most efficient amount of power based on structure, laws of physics, and our anatomical design. Unless your shoulder, your elbow, your arm don't grow the same way as everybody else, you can't disobey this law. So far, besides incorrectly interpreting the Xingyi classic, he has dragged Xingyi, Zhang Zhaodong lineage Xingyi, and Tai Chi into this mess, trying desperately to legitimize his incorrect elbow position. And the last one, Tai Chi, is already pretty absurd to be used to legitimize his incorrect elbow position. Which may make me wonder, what is next? Is he gonna then say the Martians have the elbow sticking out, therefore it's okay for him to stick his elbow out on the striking hand? This is simply ridiculous and absurd. Then his video still goes on for quite some time, where he keeps talking about other aspects of this guarding position argument that he has put forth, which I don't see a need to respond to, because this entire premise of 肘不离类 being a guarding position description is not true at all. So there's no reason to respond to anything that he put forth based on that premise being true. So up to this point, unless you're a branded fanboy, it should be pretty clear to you, if you have a rational and logical mind, on which side of the argument is more likely to be the truth. And hopefully, this also opens your eyes to how some of the recognized and famous members in the Chinese martial art community around the world could actually be lying about things. And because you lack the fundamental knowledge and the background information, you would not be able to spot these lies by yourselves. And like I said at the beginning of this video, right, there are three ways we can judge if somebody's theory is true or not. Firstly, and my personal favorite, is judging it with the laws of physics, because that is the most straightforward and without any room for argument or doubt. But if you are unfamiliar with the laws of physics, then of course you can look at the classical text and see what the style's founder and its predecessor has talked about certain aspect of their style and training and whatnot. And lastly, if both of these does not satisfy your needs, then we can look at the said person's combat ability and achievement.